Houston, yeah, transit to Venus, we are moving well. Oh, here we are. Yes, today we go beyond with Dr. José Morey, a multidimensional expert in so many areas, from healthcare to artificial intelligence, the space industry, transportation, and so much more. We had such a blast of a conversation. We explored so many perspectives on all of those areas, and ultimately also our own existence and what makes us human. So let's go beyond with Dr. José Morey.
Go beyond your horizons.
Connecting from the spacecraft in transit to Venus with Dr. José Morey. José, thank you so much for connecting to the spacecraft.
Volandino, thank you so much. How is it? How close are you to Venus right now?
Still quite a while. So I'm very excited that in transit I have the honor and the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm very excited because José is a real Renaissance man. He does so many things and he does them so well. He's been working and has amazing expertise in the health area, in artificial intelligence, in the space industry, transportation, and has worked with NASA, Forbes, MIT, with IBM Watson, with Singularity University, which I used to visit, with Virginia University, so many amazing places. So I'm super excited, and thank you again for being here, José. And I want to begin with something very special to me, Leonardo Da Vinci. Because, I have seen a few of your interviews, and in one of your interviews, in one of your talks, you speak about Da Vinci, very, very, very interesting things. I used to be a huge fan of Da Vinci since I was a little boy, not just of his creativity, but the way he would observe everything in such depth, his famous notebooks. And in one of your talks, you speak about Leonardo sometimes struggling as well, sometimes having doubts. So my first question to you, José, is in these difficult times, in these times of isolation, of lockdown, what can we learn about that expansive mind of Da Vinci and other traits as individuals, as groups, as companies? What can we learn from him?
Volandino, you touch my heartstrings because obviously, as you know, Leonardo is one of my mentors that I look up to. Yeah. And I think he has a very unique perspective that could help us right now in this time. Leonardo was the kind of person that always sought out to be continually stretching his limits. He wasn't the kind of person that dilly-daddled or wasted a lot of time. He was constantly learning and constantly stretching the limitations of who he was and of what he knew, of what he could do. So I think in a time like this, I think Leonardo da Vinci would be learning something new, going into and diving into something new and in some new exploratory way. He had this novel thing of where he was always seeking out other people that knew more than what he did in a particular field. If they were considered experts, let's say in architecture or in masonry or in military warfare, he was always looking to go out and learn from those people that he thought knew more than he did, to be able to add to who he was. And that's what made him so innovative, because he was constantly bringing in new thought processes and new pieces of knowledge that augmented his existing knowledge. So the fact that he learned anatomy and made him a better artist, the fact that he learned art and made him a better physician. So each one begat the other. So in times like this, I think he would just be going through YouTube and cold calling people and Zooming with people all over the world, really trying to learn as much as he can and absorb as much as he can. I think he would probably have learned several new languages. He probably would have gone into quantum computing and robotics. He probably would have been able to get a whole other 2 or 3 PhDs in the course of this COVID year.
Oh, that's a great answer. Okay, so for all the audience listening, right? remember, we are in difficult times, but we can learn new things. We can also be inspired by others that are more experts than us, different areas. And we can blend and mix lots of different disciplines. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Okay, so continuing with another topic that you speak about a lot, exponential thinking. You have spoken about the 6 Ds of the digital age. What are these 6 Ds, and how can we benefit the audience and all of us from exponential thinking? What is this exponential thinking? And again, in these difficult times when many people are losing their jobs and they look at the future and they see it all black, how can exponential thinking help us?
Yeah, well, the 60s can be brought down or coalesced into one simple thing, or exponential thinking is really one simple thing. It's working on something bigger than just yourself. Mm-hmm. Working on something bigger than just one person, something that is beyond any one person to do, doing things that will augment you. If you think of yourself or the world as a lake, and you are a pebble in that lake, once you drop into that, what you do exponentially travels through that lake, travels through time, travels through humanity, travels through space. It can affect so many people in your immediate vicinity, but it can echo throughout eternity. That is exponential thinking, not just in the present, not just in the now, thinking about how things can be, should be, how you can affect change. Most people get so bogged down and think so much comes from the outside. They never realize that they have so much more control if they really focus on the inside and they take that and they explode it outwards. That is exponential thinking. Thinking beyond where you are now and thinking into the future, not just the future of yourself, but the future of those around you, and doing things that move mountains. That is exponential thinking.
Yeah, that is beautiful. Yeah, I guess as human beings, we are predisposed to look for short-term gains, to preserve our glucose in the brain, our resources. That is the easy way, right? But you're speaking about the harder way, but the much more profound and long-lasting impact and way. That's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, now we go on to health, because of course you have been called the first intergalactic doctor, which is a name that I loved. And so you've written an essay called "The Future Shock of Medicine: How Artificial Intelligence Will Transform Disease, Death, and Doctors," reviewed by the Wall Street Journal. So I'm very active myself in deep learning and AI. So I'm very interested to know your perspective about this combination of AI and health. For example, in radiology, and you are a radiologist, we already know that using deep learning and AI models, they can achieve better accuracy than humans many times. But of course, we have the issue of trust. We have the issue of understanding what is going on in those black boxes that sometimes the AI models can be. And we can use things like Bayesian deep learning to try to estimate the uncertainty in the predictions. Now, how do you see the deployment of deep learning models in radiology and other parts of healthcare in the next 5 to 10 years? I assume that at the moment they will begin working hand in hand, cooperating, but of course the human still has the last word. But with time, as these algorithms become way better than humans, and as we understand them better, what's going to happen then? How do you see the future? In a conference once I spoke about, I told this mantra, más tiempo para lo más humano, more time for the for the activities that we enjoy as humans, talking about the far future with AI. Do you think that as AI takes over these more repetitive and mechanical tasks in healthcare, health professionals will start focusing more in activities that maybe we as humans enjoy more, like communicating, advising, exploring? What do you think about this parallel path between AI and healthcare?
Yeah, so a great question. And this is obviously again something near and dear to my heart, and I love the sentiment that you spoke about in that phrase, "Más tiempo para lo más humano, more human." I love that. AI has the ability. AI, out of all the technologies that are emerging technologies, exponential technologies, deep and future technologies that we have, artificial intelligence is unique because artificial intelligence is the one that's closest to really being our progeny, really being the closest reflection to humans themselves. The fact that we can imbue humanity into a technology unlike anything else that we've ever created, right? It's not propulsion, it's not combustion, it's not additive manufacturing, it's not gene editing. It is literally infusing what religious our religious patriarchs, our religious history has called the soul or spirit, right? We've always been looking for something supernatural. We can actually, and then trying to find where that piece of supernatural lies within us, right? But this is the first time that we can actually digitize or encode the supernatural, the soul, into a creation that we are literally building from the ground up. I mean, eventually I think we will do that also with gene editing. We'll be able to create whole new creations, and we're looking to do that, infuse it. But artificial intelligence literally will learn from how we've treated humanity in the past, and it will be a reflection of us in a certain perspective. And when people think about AI and they think about the horrors of potential AI that it can do uncontrolled, really that's a self-reflection, because they understand that humanity has caused some horrific things to each other. And if we're creating something that is going to learn from the way we've treated ourselves in the past, then it can potentially have dramatic, horrific consequences because it's learning from us. But hopefully, the true nirvana of AI is that hopefully AI will be our salvation. AI will hopefully correct the biases that we have caused, undo the wrongs that we have created, that we have done upon ourselves. And that's one of the issues with artificial intelligence, is that currently at its base form, where it is right now, it has AI is simplistically two things, right? It's data and mathematics. That's it. At its core, it's data and mathematics. The mathematics is getting super advanced, right? We're getting the Googles and the Amazons and all those advanced startups that are out there. The algorithms are getting more complex with convolutional neural networks and with GANs and with quantum computing now kind of pushing the limits of what we can actually do. That's going like crazy. The problem lies really in the data. It doesn't really matter how advanced the computational algorithm is, how fancy your math is. If your data is biased, then the outcome is going to be biased. And that's really what we're finding. So that's the biggest issue in artificial intelligence in healthcare, in that if we continue to perpetuate and create only data sets that are based on, one certain ethnicity or one certain socioeconomic status, then the outcomes are inherently going to be biased. That is the worst case scenario that we can have, is that we perpetuate systemic inequalities. And as we see with all these advanced technologies, sometimes that creates worsening digital divides between the haves and the have-nots. And we need to make sure that as we develop these new technologies, we don't perpetuate those inequalities. So how do we fix that? Well, we need to make sure that people of diverse backgrounds, diverse genders, ethnicities, socioeconomic status are involved in creating these applications, involved in their creation, involved in the data aggregation. Make sure that their data is there and is not biased, not based on old methodologies, but based on the true realities of as unbiased as we possibly can be in our current form. We always like to look back in time and say, oh, they were so bad because X, Y, Z. Well, it was a different time. And I think we have to take that into consideration, that we just have to take what they did incorrectly, that now we know is incorrect in our time, and fix it and then move forward. But realizing that we also might have current biases that our future selves will look back and say, oh my God, look at the way they were doing things. They were so biased. So we have to be cognizant that we ourselves have these unrealized biases that we're creating that are going to hopefully have to be fixed in the future. Now, from a practical perspective, as far as like a physician is concerned, I don't see artificial intelligence taking over our jobs in the near future, right? I do, however, see that physicians that use artificial intelligence will take over the jobs of physicians that don't use artificial intelligence. It's just an economy of scale. Just like any other kind of automation, any type of augmentation. Humans, the reason that we evolved to the top of the food chain is because we've always been augmenting ourselves with technology. We did it since we created, long pointy sticks to be able to poke down, things that were higher in the tree, or to be able to go catch that animal, or be able to create bows and arrows that can fly faster than we can to get them from far away. I mean, all those things were augmentations to ourselves, right? We don't think about it, but we have to say, oh man, I evolved these two legs. This is really a poor mechanism of travel. It's good for some things, but it's definitely not as good as a plane, right? I can't get to New York in the same amount of time if I walk as if I fly. A plane, a car, those are augmentations to our physical limitations that we have evolved over time. AI is just a simple other augmentation. It can compute data much faster than our natural computers can do. Now, our natural computers can do other things still way better, but AI can do other things way better than what we have up here. And that is where they're going to augment us. And so the people that use it, just like early caveman, the ones who use tools were able to dominate the ones who didn't use tools. Same thing with AI. The doctors and physicians that use tools will dominate those that do not. Now, when you think about way into the future, how will that eventually evolve? Well, two things I think that people start getting they don't take into consideration. Number one, they consider that the rest of the world stays the same. The only thing that's changing is our job. Well, no, the whole rest of the world will look very, very different, and how humanity and how governments work and what's important for humans and for societies are going to change as these technologies evolve. And to your point specifically, that thinking about, it will allow us to have more time as humans. In the future, perhaps money is not a thing, right? Perhaps you think of worlds like scientific worlds or sci-fi worlds like Star Trek. Star Trek doesn't have this. It's a very, for the lack of a better term, it's a communistic, socialistic kind of society, right? No one has really anything. Everything's kind of taken care of, and at least in certain circles. I mean, they don't go through all the socioeconomic statuses, but they have this kind of nirvana perspective to them. Right? There's no wars amongst humans. Wars is gone. It's just one world. I mean, right now, if you look about it, we haven't lived without a time of someone fighting somebody, since almost the dawn of humanity, right? So that whole concept of what the world could be like completely changes. So people start getting concerned that AI is going to take people's jobs. Well, you know what? In the future, people may not have jobs. It might be a completely different setup. So you're worried about something that doesn't even make sense, right? It'd be like going back 2,000 years ago and people saying, oh, what am I going to do when there's no charcoal or no horse and buggy? People don't use horse and buggies. You don't have to worry about it. It's going to be a different world. It's going to be completely different. So that's the one thing that I usually tell my colleagues to start off like, you have to think that you can't just think inward, right? It's not just one job and everything else is the same. No, the whole world is changing and your job will change with that. But in the transition, I see this evolution happening. I see that we are going to be able to go back and do more things with our patients. We're going to be able to focus on our patients. I think a lot of these tools right now we're super specialized, right? There are cardiologists, there are surgeons, and the surgeons are subdivided into, the surgeon that only does hands, only does, hips, only does gallbladders. Like, people are super, super specialized nowadays. I think we're going to see that start going away. I think we're actually going to go back. We're going to go back to people becoming more general physicians and having augmentations that do some of this subspecialty, and being able to almost be like a Dr. House, where you have people that do a lot of things that cover a lot of specialties, because you have all these tools that augment them and allow them to be able to do that. Right now, it's impossible. You need to be subspecialized because it's really hard to keep up from a perspective of all the knowledge that's out there. But if you have an artificial intelligence that's keeping up with all that, then you can do more things, obviously, but with the help of the AI. So that's how I see the short, the medium, and then eventually the long term playing out with artificial intelligence from a business and a physician perspective.
Wow. There are so many interesting things in what you've said, like so many. I mean, I love your perspective of the way we project AI towards the future is a reflection of things that we've done as humans in the past. That's why I feel we have the responsibility and the opportunity to create the future that we want. And it's so beautiful also what you said of how everything is interconnected. It's not just the jobs, it's not this, like everything is interconnected, so everything is going to change. Well, beautiful, amazing, fascinating. So before we move on to space, that is the next thing, space industry, actually, I will ask you something else that you just reminded me of.
Sure.
One of the things I dream about is what I call the artificial researcher. We all know GPT-3, right? GPT-3, we'll have GPT-4, GPT-5, GPT-8. Okay. In the moment that we have a deep learning system that, of course, is not going to be conscious, but if it is able to comprehend enough the connections between concepts, etc., the day that such a system is able to take the medical research of the last 200 years or hundreds of years and understand the connections there and produce new ones, that day that system could advance our medical knowledge in a few hours more than humans in hundreds of years. How far do you think we will get there, and how far do you think something like that is?
Do I think we will get there? Yes. When will it be? That is a harder question. There's that old adage of people tend to underestimate what can happen in 1 year, but overestimate what can happen in 10 years. And that's specifically for these types of exponential technologies. The one thing that we're learning, especially in healthcare, though, is how little we truly know about wellness and how that transitions to pathology or disease. That we know a lot about disease. We know very little. We know some about wellness, but not as much. But we know almost nothing about that transition. How does someone transition from the moment that they have no hypertension to when they start becoming hypertensive? I know now we have the pre-hypertension, but we really have little understanding of how people transition from no disease to then diabetes, right? Or no disease to then a heart attack. We understand the certain steps, but the little incremental steps, every little step that it takes to get to that eventual disease process is not as well understood. And that's one of the major gaps. The other major gap in healthcare is that healthcare, amongst everything else, our data was never structured for ML. It was never structured for deep learning. As opposed to the finance sector, as opposed to, let's say, the aircraft or other kind of data-heavy aspects, we were created. Digitization of healthcare, especially in the United States, started after Obamacare, after the ACA. That's really what kind of pushed us into a digital world in healthcare. However, those large healthcare entities, large electronic health records, were never envisioning machine learning being applied to their data. So the data that we have amongst large healthcare entities, whether it's a academic hospital, it's a private hospital, or whether it's a large pharmaceutical company, it's all siloed. So it doesn't really interplay even amongst that one particular entity. And then you talk about how does that data interplay with other entities? Well, if you are, let's say, at Massachusetts General Hospital, to get the files from there to, let's say, MD Anderson down in Texas, usually you still have to carry physical component because there's no interconnection. You either have to get a printed paper, or you have to get like a DVD. That's how broken the interoperability is a huge problem. So there are so many obstacles that early AI is revealing, though. AI is revealing these problems. Once we solve those problems, that's a step closer to what you're talking about. But I think another question that you may have had in there was almost a singularity event of when do we know that AI is
related,
yeah. And I instead of GPT-3, I would go back to GPT-2. And honestly, some of the things that GPT-2 did around, I don't know if you saw that story about the unicorn story that GPT-2.
Yes.
Oh my God, that story in and of itself, I think, and sometimes I start wondering, like, perhaps, like certain interconnections that we have, you talk about the black box, certain interconnections that these algorithms are making. I often sometimes wonder, is there a little bit of sentience in all of these? maybe not, definitely not sentience to the level of perhaps an adult, but perhaps sentience to the level of I don't know, a slug, a worm. Like, when is sentience, right?
Exactly. That is the question. We don't really know what sentience is, so it's all open wide. I mean,
so, but when I read that unicorn story, I was like, I think this is one of the most creative things that anyone, whether it's Shakespeare or Da Vinci or I think if I read that and no one told me a computer did that, I would have automatically assumed that was done by.
Well, I mean, you are just taking me in one of my favorite directions. Robert Sapolsky, the famous scientist from Stanford, he has this beautiful talk where he says, what are the differences in regards to the nervous system between the primates and the humans in terms of the genes? There is very little percentage of difference, and that percentage of difference is expressed. The primates have different stuff in the immune system, the hair, the pelvic position, whatever. But the only real difference in terms of the brain, regarding the brain, is that during the the development of the fetus, there is like 3 times more rounds or whatever. I don't remember the details. So basically, we have 3 times more neurons. And he says, and that qualitative difference seems to be the responsible for our music symphonies and our philosophy and everything. So is this eternal question of, if we increase complexity, that this is what we started to see with GPT-2 or 3, if we just increase complexity more and more and more, do we start to see the emergence of some qualitative difference? And this connects with the sentience stuff that you're talking about. I'm super fascinated by this question that nobody really knows yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, but that's why, to your question, I would point, like, in the future, you always see things retrospectively, right? You never really, as you're in the moment, how important what you're doing may be. But I think we will get there. We will get there. It's just a matter of time. But I think when history is done, when we are there and we look back, I often wonder, there's a couple of things I wonder, and this is one of the ones I wonder, is, have we already hit the singularity? We just don't realize it. Like, we have actually created sentience, but we are not sentient enough to realize its sentience.
Oh, that's very, very cool perspective.
So that's something but it really was the GPT-2 reading that made me start thinking that, because I was reading this and I was like, and I've actually given presentations to residents and others on that very thing, and I'll read the whole thing because I love it. Every time I read it, I'm like, tell me that's not human. Tell me a human didn't do that. If I had not just told you a computer, and if I did not just give you the input and now you saw the output, you would have. I don't think anyone would ever said. I mean, I wouldn't have. So. But it was cheap. It was that story that made me start thinking, I wonder if we have a small amount of sentience, but we just don't recognize it, and starting to try to see how we can analyze that would be an interesting study and an interesting kind of experiment to play.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I resonate with that. That's so interesting what you say, that we may not be aware that we may have hit something connected to that. Wow. Well, let's see what happens in the next few years when we look back.
Well, because I think what everyone is thinking in their mind is that an AI is going to be like you and me. It's going to have it's going to be like computers where they're talking. But we have to realize, look how we evolve. I mean, we start as fetal embryonic, and then go off, and then we're babies once we're born, right? And then we're transitioning. Like, there are certain little things that are the sentient AI that we're creating, that we are doing incremental changes. We are watching this embryonic development of sentience. And I think, just like with your real child, when people talk about enjoy the time and watch it grow, I think we're not realizing that we are seeing that right now, and we're not enjoying the time with our growing AI sentience that we're actually developing.
I love that. It's almost as if these deep learning models were the children, the beginning of that development. That's great. I love that. Wow. It's a lot of a lot of things come to mind. This is fascinating. Thank you, Jose. So, okay, now let's jump a little bit to space. You work a lot with space industry, with NASA, with a lot of different countries. We are, a lot of people, myself included, we are super excited about the latest news with SpaceX, Starship, the upcoming missions to the moon, Artemis, later on to Mars. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going to be the role also of artificial intelligence in space? And also, what about the health? I mean, we're talking about these missions to the moon and Mars, and we know Elon Musk wants to terraform Mars. Do you guys already have solutions for the health challenges that may happen? For example, with Starship going to Mars, I don't know, it's going to be 6 months, 8 months. I don't know how long it's going to be the trip. And once they get there, do we already have solutions to the health challenges coming up?
So that's one of the biggest things, right? We've had the mechanical means to get to Mars for a long time. Obviously, you have to craft it and build it and send it up. But from a mechanical perspective, we have the components. I mean, we've sent stuff into interstellar space, so getting to another planet's not an issue. We have tons of rovers there, right? But with humans, it's the physiologic barriers that we have because we evolved here on 1G, right? And we evolved with very little radiation comparative to space because of the ionosphere that we're protected under. So that's always been the greatest limitation is how do you get humans safely there and safely back? And as Elon has said, I mean, a lot of people know, I mean, this is going to be risky. And there's two components because you're talking one thing NASA might do or other governmental agency, and there's another that the private sector might do. I mean, Elon's talked a lot about perhaps just doing this on his own and just SpaceX, a commercial player, actually just sending things up without government intervention. So and that's going to be interesting. And he's also mentioned that, you know, it might for at least his people, not the NASA people, but for his people, he said it might be a one-way trip.
Yeah.
So
there are actually a lot of people around the world that signed up for this, right? Or that other program for a one-way. Lots of people. This is fascinating also.
I mean, there's something, I think that's one of the things about being human, though, that's always been in us. And Carl Sagan said it a lot, but you know, we owe a lot to those early travelers that pushed the boundaries. And there's something in us that's always explorers. To your point of what the future will be like, perhaps, you know, jobs aren't important and people will be exploring. I mean, that's what humanity becomes. So there won't be a need for all these kind of subspecialties of jobs because the main thing that people will be doing 100 or 200 years from now is exploring, and there is plenty of space to do that, right?
Yeah, I wish we did that.
It'd be amazing if we were just an entire, you know, colony of scientists and artists, and we just explored and created art all the time. I think that would be
a blast,
right? If we were all just a bunch of Leonardo Da Vinci's. But yeah, there is a big component. NASA's working a lot. That's a lot of the things that I was helping with the NASA ITech project. Is looking at those types of technology gaps that are going to be able to solve the solution for us to get up there. There are a lot of problems that we have. The lack of gravity is an issue. The musculoskeletal stuff we've been able to solve. So the bone density and the muscle mass, there are solutions for that, and we're looking for other solutions as well. But that's why a lot of the astronauts, a big component of their day is exercise to be able to minimize those kinds of issues. You know, people have been looking into developing artificial gravity with like centrifuge type of spaceship. Where you create a type of force at least. So people have been looking into that.
Is that actually? I'm really fascinated by that. Do you see that as practical? Do you think they will be able to do it?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, so this is something I tell people. So science, the difference between science fiction and science fact are just a few letters. And we've often seen that in science fiction, in movies, eventually we get up to that point. And I think those types of things will be some component, unless someone figures out how to create gravity in some other way, which is completely plausible as well. But we honestly don't really understand what gravity is. We talk about gravity because we know it exists, but we don't truly know how that is actually produced. So the mathematics for how you generate gravity is still something we need to figure out. But maybe it has to do with a lot. I mean, there's a lot of I'm not a physicist, but there's a lot of theories of how to maybe do that. So I think we have to take everything into consideration until we actually solve it. And I think it is one practical way that we can do it. It's going to take money and it's going to take experimentation, but I think it is one plausible way of trying to mitigate that. The other issues that we have to deal with is radiation, obviously, and radiation is huge, but we have ways to do that as well. We use water right now to kind of block the radiation. Obviously, there's other forms of radiation blockage, but water is a great one. But water is very heavy, so that's kind of an issue from that perspective. There's even been talk about one thing that we found is that all the Wi-Fi that there is, if we had the ionosphere that the world has to block out the radiation. Well, we've actually, as a subsequent of new Wi-Fi has actually created a separate blocking mechanism of radiation. With so much Wi-Fi. Yeah, it was a recent kind of discussion or discovery. So people have been talking about, well, what if we just use like a very super powerful Wi-Fi to develop the ship, almost like a force field? So
that's really great.
There's that kind of kinds of discussions. But there's been other discussions as well to relative seriousness. People have talked about doing preventive surgeries, like removing things like gallbladders and appendixes, and even removing things like ovaries and stuff like that. There's been serious discussions about that in the past.
Wow.
Those aren't conversations that are being carried on anymore, but those are things that people have discussed previously, to doing like preventative kinds of things, to be able to mitigate, that being a problem going to the future. Other issues that we've had is because of the gravity, the brain swelling is an issue. So that's a big problem. Blindness is another issue because of increased pressure within your eyes, and pressure on the back of the eye and on the back of the optic nerve, the optic cup. So there's been a lot of issues with that. So gravity is a big issue. The other one people have had, and this one's kind of new or mixed, there's still mixed data on this, is dementia.
Oh.
They're not really sure if it's because of the increased pressure or because of the radiation somehow is causing potentially the dementia. So those are all things that people are trying to figure out how to mitigate. But one thing that they've seen, at least in some of those dementia trials, is that females, for whatever reason, at least in the animal studies that they've done, have a less propensity to develop at least the dementia issues when exposed to radiation.
So are these tests that they did in the International Space Station or something like that? No,
you can simulate the radiation here on Earth.
Oh, okay.
There are different places that you can simulate, but you can also, yes, they have done the testing on the ISS, but yeah, you can simulate the radiation here, and you can actually simulate the 0G here. There are 0G chambers. They've done all that kind of stuff. But what they found is that the female rats, at least, had less degree of dementia when they were exposed to space-like environments. So that's also a practical reason why people are having discussion. There's obviously it's good for science and it's good for humanity to have full female crews, because we've had full male crews for such a long time. Why not have full female crews now? There is that part of the humanity perspective, but from a science perspective, there's actually some data saying that females are more resilient to space-like environments, and at least currently, without having the other things that we can do tertiarily to help protect them. But so that's another kind of other component to argue about full female crews to deep space, whether it's Mars and beyond, at least until we start trying to figure out.
That's very good. Okay, to all women in the audience, start getting ready for joining the Space Corps in the future.
I would definitely, to all the women in the audience, I would definitely say we need all of you to go into science for sure, because there's way too many men in this field.
Yes.
So definitely get all your little girls going into STEM. That's a big thing.
Beautiful, beautiful. I mean, you've given us a very detailed and beautiful view about these challenges in space. And you've also spoken about when we become an exospecies, when we live outside of Earth, and connecting with these beautiful perspectives that you told us before. When we're an exospecies and we look back and we look at these times when we used to live all together packed in this little compact planet, what do you think when people look back? What will they think about the way we used to live at these times with all our chaos in here?
Yeah, it's interesting the thing I think we'll do something. We'll be nostalgic. I think we'll be nostalgic to a point. It eventually gets to the point, kind of like, I don't know if Volandino, if you have any kids on the spaceship or not, but no, that's all right. Wow. But when you talk to, like, at least my son, I have a 14-year-old, kids think about, he makes fun of me growing up in the 80s, and he'll say, why did you do that? And I think at some point there'll be a transition to a certain degree where people will look back and not really understand how things kind of were. But there'll be a transition. There'll be a nostalgia. And I hope we kind of take the best of us with us and leave the worst of us behind. And hopefully the future humanity looks back on us and doesn't judge us as roughly as sometimes we judge our predecessors, understanding that, we did the best we could with the limitations of our understanding in the time. And I think that's something that we tend to forget and tend to almost talk down to people about, how people used to be. And yes, we need to evolve and we need to get better. I think people today shouldn't be living as if they were living 40 years ago or 60 years ago. I think that's unconscionable. I think there's plenty of reason to speak to those people and try to mitigate those things. But to look at people 500 years ago and try to judge them for the way they lived 500 years ago, I think that's an erroneous way to kind of look back on your predecessors. The one thing that I hope that we take with us, I interviewed a couple of people, and one of the things that I've interviewed some linguists, and they talk about how the words mama and papa pretty much throughout history and pretty much throughout cultures is the same. Like you can pretty much say mother and father using those kind of words, mama, papa, abba, ada. Is pretty much throughout history and throughout cultures, it's the same way. Like there's something unique about familial relationships, and then something even more special about parental relationships, father and child, mother and child, that I think, for everything else that we do wrong as humans, I think that is something that's very special. And I hope that those kinds of things are the things that we take with us. I hope that at our core, we still always remember the interconnection that humanity has amongst families and amongst each other. And I hope, if nothing else, I hope that's perpetuated throughout the universe. Because if I think we focus on those kinds of things, the universal things that have brought everyone together throughout history, like I can go to any country and use those similar words and people will know who I'm referencing. I can go probably to some of the Amazonian tribes and probably get something similar and they would understand me. So I hope that 1,000 years from now, we will have that in common still, that people will still understand the importance of connectivity and the importance of that familial and paternal and those connections between family. I think that's something I hope we take with us forever.
That is absolutely beautiful and resonates a lot. When I interact with my nieces and my nephew who are on Earth, and sometimes I land with my spacecraft and I visit them, and yes, we can see we are from different generations, which is a bit like if we were from different planets. But as you say, there is this universal way of connecting with the people that you care about and the people that you love. That is always there. And this is what you say. I think this is what should remain. And I think what will remain, instead of judging between generations or between species, appreciating the parts that connect us. Yeah. Beautiful. All right. And we're moving towards the end of our journey. And I want to ask you one last fascinating thing about space. You've talked in an interview about extremophiles. This is something that really fascinates me because you talk about all these different environments where life thrives. And you talk about working with these extremophiles to produce entities that are able to do things that are useful for humans, these little machines that we can utilize to find solutions to specific problems. Could you tell us about something about this fascinating world of extremophiles?
Yeah, so for your audience, extremophiles are extreme bacteria that live in extreme environments. And that's why they're called extreme bacteria. So extreme environments would be things like in volcanoes, or that grow after, cataclysmic events like 3 Mile Island and other radioactive issues, or that live in very cold environments, or very acidic or very basic environments, or bacteria or animals that grow in deep pressure, like way under the ocean, or even things that can be found in space or that thrive on the space station. So those things are extremophiles. And the thing that's unique about them is that it gives us a glimpse into how life can evolve. So how we know how life can evolve in various forms, but in these extreme conditions, it gives us a unique perspective of how things can get energy, how they can thrive, and how they can reproduce, because that will give us potential ideas of where and how things can evolve outside of just Earth. Everything on Earth is carbon-based. And that's one of the reasons, and we're carbon-based, and then we have a lot of water. So that's the reason we're always looking for water, really, because this concept of, well, life here required water. So the probability of us finding life similar to ours is tied to the ability for us to find water on other planets. So that's one of the two reasons why we're always looking for water in other places, because it's something that we will require if we're going to ever, live in that location. And then B, it's something that we think is required for life. But I think the scientists that have been proposing that, and they've become smaller in number, but the scientists that propose that, I feel, were short-sighted, because that is something that, yes, that's how life evolved here, but that has nothing to do with potentially how life may evolve somewhere else. So that's the reason we study extremophiles, because perhaps life on a volcanic planet is completely, based on something completely else that we haven't even figured out yet. Or maybe there's a life on another planet that's completely based on diamonds. Well, I guess that's carbon, but something based on silica or something like that. It's a completely different organic structure. So that's the kind of concept that extremophiles help us, being able to see the extremes of evolution, to be able to start imagining how life could live other places. And then those extreme bacteria or other kind of extreme animals can help us learn how to mitigate things here on Earth, like perhaps a bacteria that's lived amongst a bunch of other viruses and had to fight those viruses to be able to survive. So we can find the proteins that it creates to create antiviral medications, or be able to have a fungus that fights off all these other bacteria. So we can create things that fight off bacteria based on what that fungus makes. Maybe a new antibiotic or something to destroy biofilms. So that's the kinds of things that we can learn from extremophiles. Same concept as to this whole thing you mentioned earlier, how Elon wants to terraform Mars. Well, climate change is something that's happening here, and we study. NASA is one of the greatest studies of Earth, and the reason we study climate change, why we know so much about climate change, is really because NASA wants to figure out how to do terraforming, and really wants to figure out how these planets went through their cataclysmic events. Because we know now from studying Mars that there appears to have been many oceans on Mars, and perhaps the whole thing was underwater. And we go back millions of years ago, maybe it looked identical to us, maybe not. But the more we learn about how climate change affects us here, then we can try to figure out why climate change happened in another planet. But the inverse is still true. The same thing with the how life can evolve different ways. Perhaps climate change on Jupiter or on Mars or on all these other planets, perhaps their climate change has completely different reasons as to why it occurred, because they have completely different environments. So although it's a good starting point, and we have to do it because we have no other place that we can study as much as Earth, and it's the only place we have that we can actually sustain life as of right now. So we have to make sure that we don't turn into a Mars, or that we don't turn into a Mercury or a Venus. No offense, but we have to be careful that we take care of what we have, because it's the only one we have at the moment. So.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, we have to take care of it. For God's sake, we have to. All right, right. So yeah, this extremophile. I mean, it's very interesting because right, a lot of people look at viruses and bacteria as the enemies, but the reality, of course, is that first of all, we are full of them inside of us and over us, and that they can be very useful for us as well. I mean, everything is interconnected. We go back to the interconnection of everything, right? It's not clear what is a friend and what is an enemy, really. It's a tricky concept. All right. So to finish our beautiful journey on transit to Venus, connecting with the most important thing that we all agree on, the human connections, a couple of questions that I will fuse into one. You have said that a person that had a big influence in you, had a great impact in you, was your abuela, your abuelita, your grandmother.
Yeah.
So I would love to ask you, why was she so important to you? What was that important influence? And at the same time, in parallel, if you could tell us, looking at the human condition and at human beings, one thing that you really love about the human condition and humans, their behavior or whatever, and one thing that frustrates you as well about them.
Yeah. So with my family, or my grandmother's concern, mi abuela, she was always someone of great kindness.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't have much means. We grew up with her very poor. But no one would have ever known. I mean, I never knew that we were poor. Because she never lived a life that way. She lived a life of fullness. And she always, despite the fact that she really didn't have much, she always had something to give to others. Like, regardless of whoever came over, she always had something to give to them. It may not have been, the most extravagant thing, but it was a lot for her because she didn't have a lot to give. And that's something that I've learned from her. And that's something that I try to take with me wherever I go. And that's something that I try to do with everything that all the projects that I do and the different endeavors I undertake, is to always remember that you can always give. You can always give. No matter how little you think you have, you can always give. And people ask me all the time, especially with moonshots, like, well, what can I do? And I always say, you know what? It's not about helping 1,000 people. If you have the ability to help 1,000 people, then yes, I think you should help 1,000 people. But if you have the ability to just help one person, then I believe it is your responsibility to help that one person. And if everyone just took that concept to help the people that they can help, if we all did that, then I think we'd have a lot less issues than we currently have in a lot of respects. The things that I love about humanity is that humanity, even in its darkest moments, you can often find some of the most beautiful things that people can do for each other. Even when you might think that those people are enemies. You hear about stories of soldiers in war stopping and celebrating holidays together. That if we really stop and focus on that there's more that brings us together than splits us apart, then humanity can do some of the most beautiful things. And when you start focusing on those things, then you can start working on those moonshots, those things that are bigger than just one person. Because you set your differences aside and you really try to do things that are bigger than anyone could ever have imagined and bigger than anyone could do by themselves. The things that frustrate me with humanities is that we are capable of some of the most horrific ignorances that they're unfathomable. And sometimes we elevate, like, it's just like seeing car wrecks or train wrecks, like, or a fire. Like, people are attracted to that sometimes. And, I'm not sure always as to why people elevate ignorance, right, and ignorant people. And we've seen it throughout humanity, where there's this attraction. And I think one of the reasons I think this is because people like simplicity. People sometimes are afraid of complexity, because complexity takes time to sit down and really parse. Complexity isn't gut. Complexity isn't, black, white, right? Complexity is shades of gray, and trying to sit and sift through which and all of the different shades of gray. And people want that. And I think our society and our current culture has propagated simplicity to a point that it's really detrimental to society. People have to understand that everything in life is not simple. Everything has different levels of complexity, and we have to be able to embrace them and not seek out the simple, ignorant things that allow us to just be able to take life as it comes and not have to really think about things, and not have to challenge ourselves, have to challenge the way we think, have to challenge that, hey, I might be wrong, or have to challenge and say, all right, I might be right, but there are exceptions to the way I think. And that ignorance is something that constantly frustrates me.
This is so important what you're saying, because we go back to the culture of everything easy, everything comfortable, everything simple, short term, or the culture of effort, of putting our physiology and our mind through a certain stress, a certain effort that is going to keep us healthy as well. And what a better way of finishing that with a beautiful example of your abuelita, of your abuela, of your grandmother, that I think that all the audience and myself, we take it as really a beautiful example of what should be a life well lived. A life in which, regardless of what you have, you give. As you said, give, that's the word. I think if we give with passion, that's always going to take us to a good life. Thank you so much, Jose, for coming with me on this transit to Venus. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I hope to do it again sometime.
Definitely.
Volandino, where are you? Do you copy?
Sorry, I'm busy.
Reply, please.
Cannot go back now, sorry.
Let's go, Volandino.
I got something to do.
Where have you gone? I repeat.
Well, I just, because...
Come back, Volandino.
I wanna go beyond. 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 Thank you for following the Beyond podcast. If you enjoy it, subscribe on YouTube and support it in other channels like Patreon and others. And hope to see you soon at the Beyond podcast. Thank you.